Chapter 7 of for Khartoum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. For Khartoum by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 7. El Teb. The next morning the Gordon Highlanders and Irish Fusiliers, accompanied by a squadron of hussars and the mounted infantry, with a couple of small guns, crossed the lagoon and occupied the entrenchment. The cavalry went a little distance out, but the enemy were seen in considerable numbers, and as there might be a large force concealed among the low sandhills, no attempt was made to attack them, as it was undesirable to bring on serious fighting until the whole force were in readiness to advance. In the evening the cavalry recrossed the lagoon, as there was no water obtainable on the other side, and the animals had to depend upon the supply landed from the steamers. All day the work of disembarkation had been going on, and in spite of the heat of the blazing sun, the men had worked enthusiastically in getting the horses and stores on shore. The next day the Naval Brigade, 115 strong, all picked men from the crews of the gunboats, with 10 officers, landed. The troops on the beach were most anxious to advance, but as those beyond the lagoon had to depend entirely upon food and water carried across to them, it was unadvisable to push a larger body of men forward, especially as the natives had clearly no intentions of attacking them, contenting themselves by keeping up a distant fire. "I expect the beggars are gathering their forces just as we are gathering ours," one of the hussars said, as they sat round a fire they had lighted with some driftwood picked up on the shore. The heat was in no way required, but the light was cheerful, and the smoke kept away troublesome insects. "They reckon," another said, "upon falling upon us on the march, as they did upon Baker's men, but they will find they have got into the wrong box." "General Baker came down himself in the steamboat which arrived this afternoon. I heard one of the officers say so," Edgar put in. "It will be a satisfaction to him to see these fellows well licked on nearly the same ground where they cut up his force." "Ah, I expect Baker would give his right hand to lead the cavalry in the charge. What a splendid officer he is! There is not a man in the army can handle cavalry as he can. And wouldn't the 10th fight with their old colonel at their head?" There was a general chorus of assent. "How splendidly he fought in Turkey," another trooper said. "I am told the Turks he led would have done anything for him, and had just the same confidence in him our chaps used to have. If he had been in command of the whole army, instead of those rotten old pashas, the Russians would have found it a very different job. I wonder when we are going on. Now we have got all the stores ashore, it will be precious slow work being stuck on this beach." "We are waiting for the 65th, a sergeant said. "I heard the Serapis was expected this morning. It is great luck for them getting a fight without any trouble at all. How pleased they must have been when they heard at Aden that they were to be stopped on their way up to have a share in the affair." "Yes, I call that a first-rate piece of luck," another agreed, "to have a good fight and then go straight home, while we have got nothing to look forward to afterwards but garrison duty in Cairo. I would rather be going on to India 50 times." "Like enough we may see some service there," the sergeant said. "If this Mahdi fellow comes down, which they say he means to do, to invade Egypt, you may be sure we shall all have to go up to stop him." "I don't call it fighting against these savages," one of the troopers said. "What chance have they got against regular troops?" "I don't know, Johnson. The Zulus were savages, and they made a pretty tough fight against us. I suppose you don't want anything much harder than that. These fellows have been every bit as brave as the Zulus. They cut Hicks Pasha's army into mincemeat, and they have licked 2 Egyptian armies down in this neighbourhood. If you think this is going to be no harder work than a field day at Aldershot, I think you are likely to find you are mistaken." "You don't suppose, Sergeant, that these naked beggars are going to stand for a moment against a charge of 800 cavalry?" It did not seem as if naked savages could stand infantry armed with breech-loaders, but you see the Zulus did. "It does not seem possible these Arabs can stand for a moment against our charge, but you see we do not understand these fellows. One knows what regular infantry can do against cavalry, and it may be we shall find that these Arabs are not to be ridden over as easily as we think. When you have got to reckon with men who don't care the snap of a finger whether they are killed or not, you never can count upon an easy victory, however badly they may be armed, and however undisciplined they may be. There is 9 o'clock," he broke off, as the bells on board the gunboats rang out twice. A moment later a bugle sounded "Lights out," and the call was repeated by the buglers and trumpeters of the various corps, and a few minutes later the men stretched themselves out on the sand, and silence reigned in the camp. The next morning Admiral Hewitt set on shore 8 7-pounder guns from the fleet, to take the place of the same number of little camel guns which had been found to be of no real utility. At noon the smoke of a steamer was made out in the distance, and a few hours later the Serapis, whose engines had gone wrong, arrived with the 65th, who were landed at once and immediately crossed the lagoon to the entrenchment, and it was known that the advance would at once begin. In addition to the guns sent on shore from the fleet, the artillery had 10 brass mountain guns and 4 Krupps. The naval brigade had with them 2 9-pounders, 3 Gatlings, and 3 Gardners. The troops were divided into 2 brigades, the first consisting of 610 men of the Rifles, 751 Gordon Highlanders, and 334 of the Irish Regiment. The second brigade of 761 Royal Highlanders, 500 of the 65th, 361 Royal Marine Artillery and Infantry, and 100 Royal Engineers. There were 600 camels for the transport, 350 mules, and 100 camels for the ambulance corps, while the camel battery was composed of 80 camels and 100 men. In the course of the afternoon, Major Harvey and Lieutenant Colonel Burnaby rode out 2 miles beyond the entrenchment and planted a white flag with a letter attached to the flagstaff, calling upon the enemy to retire and allow us to pass on to Tokar without opposition. They were fired at by the Arabs, and as the flag disappeared a short time after the officers had returned, there was no doubt that the letter would arrive at its destination. Before nightfall the whole of the force, with the exception of 150 men left to defend the stores on the beach, had crossed the lagoon. 300 men were to remain in the entrenchment when the rest marched, to defend the transport animals and stores left there against any attacks. Bivouac fires were lighted, and round these the troops sat smoking and chatting until the bugle call ordered all to lie down in their ranks. They were bivouacked in the order in which they were to advance. The formation was to be a sort of square, of which the Gordon Highlanders were to form the front face, the Royal Highlanders the rear line, the Irish Fusiliers the right face, with the Rifles inside them. The 65th were on the outside of the left face, the Marines being inside them. The whole square was about 250 yards long by 150 deep. Between the Marines and Rifles in the centre were stationed the transport animals with the reserve ammunition and hospital appliances. The camel battery with the 7-pounders was to remain in reserve in the centre of the square, while the sailors with the 6 marine guns were placed at the left front of the square, next to the Gordon Highlanders. The bivouac fires were kept up all night, as it was considered probable that the enemy, who occasionally fired from a distance, might attempt an attack upon the sleeping force. The night, however, passed quietly, but towards morning rain fell heavily, soaking the troops as they lay, and there was a general feeling of gladness when the reveille called them to their feet. Fresh fuel was thrown on to the fires, and the men tried as best they could to dry themselves. The kettles were boiled and breakfast eaten, and the cavalry recrossed the lagoon to the beach to give their horses water at the tanks there. They then rejoined the infantry. Their place was to be in the rear of the square, but 2 squadrons were to move in extended order as scouts a mile in front of it and on both flanks. Their orders were that, if attacked, they were not to charge the enemy, but to open right and left, and to retire at once, and rejoin the main body in the rear of the square, so as to allow a clear space for the sweep of the infantry fire. The infantry were to fire only in volleys on word of command, and were not to open fire until within 300 yards of the enemy. Moving out from the camp, the force was halted on open ground, and a brief inspection made to see that all was in order, and soon after 8 o'clock the advance began in earnest. As soon as they moved forward the enemy could be seen retiring, evidently bent upon pursuing the same tactics they had done upon the occasion of the advance of Baker Pasha's force from the same halting place a month before. The officers with their glasses could make them out swarming along a slight ridge of ground in the neighbourhood of the wells. Their flags extended along a front a mile in length, and guns could be made out in position. As the column advanced, the enemy cleared off from the rising ground, but whether they had retired behind the ridge and were there waiting in readiness to pour out to the attack, or whether they were moving round to fall upon the flank of the column, was uncertain. As the column neared the position, it could be seen that a breastwork had been thrown up, and that the position of the guns had been well chosen, and the enemy could now be made out crowded among the bushes on the ridge. It was now 10 o'clock. The column was advancing briskly to the martial music of the pipes of the Royal Highlanders. The cavalry scouts had moved away from the front, and the square was within 500 yards of the ridge. They were not, however, advancing directly against it, but were moving in a line almost parallel to its face, as General Graham had determined to pass it and then attack in flank, as it was evident that there would be serious loss in a front attack upon a position so strongly held and fortified. It was a trying moment, for all expected that the silence so far preserved by the enemy would be broken by the roar of cannon and the discharge of musketry, and that it would be followed by the tremendous rush that had proved fatal to Baker's force. But the square kept its way for some distance across the face before the enemy opened fire. They had doubtless expected that a direct attack would be made upon their position, and the passage of the troops without the slightest attention to themselves surprised and disconcerted them. But at last they perceived that they must take the offensive, and suddenly a hot fire of musketry broke out from bush and earthwork, while the Krupp guns, manned by the soldiers who had formed part of the Tokar garrison, opened fire. The distance was but 400 yards, and several of the men fell out from their places in the ranks wounded, but the greater part of the shot and bullets flew overhead. No reply to the fire was made by the square, but its direction was changed a little more to the right, so as to take it somewhat farther from the face of the enemy's position. The artillery now opened fire upon the guns of the enemy, but the square kept on its course steadily, while a storm of bullets and fragments of shrapnel shell flew around them. The enemy's gunners proved that their training had been good. They worked their guns quickly, and their aim was accurate. General Baker, who was acting as head of the intelligence department, was struck in the face by a ball from one of the shrapnel shells. This embedded itself so deeply in his jaw that it could not be got out by the surgeons until after the conclusion of the fight. But the gallant officer, having had his face bandaged up, remounted his horse and continued his duties throughout the day. Upon getting to a position at the end of the ridge held by the enemy, the men were ordered to lie down, while the artillery continued their fire against the enemy's batteries. At 11:45 the Arab guns ceased to fire, and the men were ordered to their feet again, and with loud cheers continued the advance. The square moved on until well in the rear of the enemy's position, and then marched straight towards it. Owing to this change in the direction of its march, the left flank of the square now became its front, and it was the 65th, with the Naval Brigade on one flank and the Royal Highlanders on the other, who were nearest to the enemy. Fast and thick the flashes of musketry broke out from the bushes, but as the square approached the fire ceased, and then groups of black forms sprang to their feet, and with loud yells rushed towards the square, waving their spears and swords. It seemed incredible that these little groups of 10 or 12 men each should intend to assail the solid lines of the British, but as fresh parties every moment sprang up and charged down, the order was given to fire. A flash of flame ran along the face of the great square, and then a continuous roar told that the breech-loading rifles were at work, while the machine guns of the sailors added their rattle to the din of the musketry. As if utterly heedless of death, the Arabs rushed forward through the leaden storm, but were mowed down like grass before it. Not one of these intrepid warriors reached the face of the square, not one turned to fly, but of those who left their shelter to attack the square, every man fell with his face to the foe. Without halting for a moment, the square kept on its way until the front line reached the bushes. Then, with a wild yell, a swarm of Arabs sprang to their feet, with so sudden and desperate a rush that they reached the sailors, and for a minute a hand-to-hand struggle took place, bayonet against spear. But the wild courage of the natives was of no avail against the steady discipline of the sailors. The assailants were swept away, and the square moved on. But the ground was now so broken with bush and rock that the even line could no longer be preserved. From every bush and from rifle pits dug among them, and from behind rough entrenchments, parties of Arabs leapt to their feet and hurled themselves in vain upon the British bayonets. As the front of the square reached the ridge that had formed the Arab position, the fight was most desperate, the enemy throwing themselves furiously on its flanks, and the Royal Highlanders and the sailors had to fight hard to win their way through them. But at last the ridge was won. 2 of the enemy's Krupp guns were captured, and as soon as the square had been formed up again in order, these were turned against the position the Arabs had now taken up in rear of their first line of defence. In the centre of the position they now occupied was a brick building, where an engine for pumping up water for irrigation purposes had formerly stood. The Arabs had loopholed the walls and surrounded the building with rifle pits. Here they made a desperate resistance, until at last the doors were burst in and the building stormed. Several mud huts were defended with equal obstinacy, and many of our men were wounded by Arabs who lay feigning death in the rifle pits, and then, when the first line of troops had passed, leaped out and rushed in among them, cutting and slashing until bayoneted or shot down. While the 65th were winning this position, the Gordon Highlanders carried the village, while the Royal Highlanders captured the redoubt at the extreme right of the position the enemy had first held. The enemy now had been driven from their last line and fled in all directions at a speed that rendered pursuit by the infantry impossible. During the last portion of the battle, the cavalry had been kept in the rear, out of the range of the enemy's fire, and the men had nothing to do but to sit quiet on their horses and watch the attack of the infantry square upon the enemy's position, fretting and fuming not a little that they were unable to take their part in what was evidently a desperate struggle. But at last bodies of the Arabs were seen streaming out from the position, and General Stewart, who was in command of the cavalry division, gave the order, and, wheeling far round to the right of the infantry, led them against a large body of Arabs in the plain beyond the ridge. The enemy did not await their attack, but fled, hotly pursued by the first and second lines for some distance. The order to cease pursuing was sounded, when it was seen that the third line, composed of 100 men, were attacked by a body of Arabs who had advanced from the left, and the main body wheeled round and advanced to assist them. But the ground between was already occupied by the Arabs. These, as the cavalry advanced, threw themselves down among the tufted hillocks and mounds which covered the whole plain. The horses in their course leaped the hillocks, swerving at the sight of the dark figures lying among them. The Arabs sprang instantly to their feet in the intervals between the horsemen and hurled their spears at them, or as they lay thrust them into the horses, and as these fell sprang upon the riders and cut them down. At the same moment a small body of mounted Arabs dashed into the fray. Most of them were cut down, but some made their way through the line, and turning the instant they did so, fell upon the rear of the charging squadron. Colonel Barrow, who commanded it, fell, but it still pressed forward, the opposition becoming every moment more severe. General Stewart led the second line to the assistance of the first, but these too were desperately opposed, and had to fight hard before they could reach them. One of the general's orderlies was killed, and 2 others wounded. Major Slade of the 10th Hussars, Lieutenant Freeman of the 19th, and Lieutenant Probyn fell, and 20 men were killed and as many wounded before the enemy retired. Colonel Webster's squadron, which made several brilliant charges at the enemy, now joined the rest of the cavalry. But the Arabs were momentarily reinforced, and after what had been seen of the desperation with which they fought, it was deemed imprudent to pursue them further. With the exception of the losses sustained by the cavalry, the total loss at the Battle of El Teb was small, amounting to only 30 killed and 142 wounded. 1 infantry officer was killed, 1 mortally wounded, and 1 severely so, while many received slight wounds. The loss of the Arabs exceeded 2,000. Edgar's squadron was among the first line when the charge was made to the assistance of Colonel Webster's squadron. He was in the rear rank and could not well see what was passing in front, and he was astounded upon seeing men spring up apparently from the earth and furiously attack the horsemen with spear and sword. He himself had a very narrow escape. His horse swerved as it leapt a low bush, and almost simultaneously a native sprang to his feet and lunged at him with his spear. Instinctively he threw himself forward on the neck of his horse, and as he did so felt the spear graze his back below the shoulders. The next moment his horse had taken him beyond the Arab's reach, but at that instant he heard a cry and saw Corporal North's horse fall with him, pierced by a spear thrust given by a native lying on the ground. Before the corporal could rise, the Arab was upon him with his sword, and struck him down with a sweeping cut upon the shoulder. Edgar had wheeled his horse round instantly, and before the blow was repeated was within striking distance of the man, and his sword fell upon the uplifted wrist. Dropping his sword, the Arab sprang upon the horse and strove to tear Edgar from the saddle, while at the same instant the Arab who had first thrust at him ran up. Fortunately he came up at the side on which his comrade was clinging to Edgar, and was therefore unable to use his spear against him. But after a moment's hesitation he plunged it into the horse, which reared high in the air and then fell. Edgar had at the moment rid himself of the man who was grasping him by shortening his sword and plunging it into his body, and as the horse reared he drew his feet from the stirrups and dropped off over his tail, coming down upon his feet just as the animal rolled over dead. The other Arab rushed at him with his spear. Edgar cut at it with his sword and severed the iron head from the staff, and then, springing forward, ran the Arab through before he could take to his sword. But several others were running up, and Edgar felt that his case was desperate. By this time the corporal, though badly wounded, had freed himself from his fallen horse, and, drawing his carbine from the bucket, shot the Arab nearest to him. The others, however, came on without a pause. Edgar and his wounded companion made a desperate defence, but both received several sword cuts, and Edgar felt the end was at hand, when, with a roar like thunder, the second line burst down upon them, and the Arabs were instantly cut down. "Take those 2 men up behind you," an officer shouted. 2 of the troopers reined in their horses and assisted Edgar and his companion to climb up behind them, and then, riding at full speed, soon regained the line. In another minute the trumpet sounded for a halt. Edgar and his companion now slipped from the horses and joined their own squadron. The corporal was scarcely able to stand, and Edgar was not in a better plight. Major Horsley rode up to them. "Not badly wounded, I hope?" he asked. "It is a miracle your getting in when once dismounted." "I think I am pretty nearly done for, sir," the corporal said, "but I wish to report that Trumpeter Smith has saved my life by coming back to my assistance when my horse was stabbed and fell with me. He killed the 2 men who attacked me, and so gave me time to free myself and to aid him in making a fight of it until the second line came up." As Corporal North concluded, he fell insensible from loss of blood. At that moment the surgeon came up. "Are we going to charge again, Major? Because if so, these men, with the others badly wounded, had better be sent across at once to the infantry. There are too many of these Arab scoundrels about for them to be left behind here. But if we are not going to charge, I will give their wounds a first dressing at once." "I don't know," the major said. "I will ride to the general and ask him, and speak to him about the wounded. Sergeant Meekings, if the order comes to charge before I return, tell off a trooper to take up each man too badly wounded to ride, and let them carry them straight across to the infantry." After giving this order he rode rapidly away, but returned in 2 or 3 minutes. "We are not going to charge again, Doctor," he said. "They are mustering too strongly for us to attempt it. The general says he will halt where we are until the worst cases of the wounded are attended to. Here, 2 of you men, dismount and assist the surgeon." "Get their jackets off, lads," the doctor said. "Take this corporal first. He is the worst case." The other wounded men were now brought up, and their wounds were all bandaged. Those who could sit a horse then mounted behind other troopers, while a number of soldiers were ordered to dismount and lay the others upon blankets and carry them in. Edgar was one of these. He had received 1 cut on the top of his head, and his helmet had alone saved his skull from being cleft. He had another gash on the right cheek. His side was laid open with a spear thrust, the weapon having fortunately glanced from his ribs, and he had another sword cut on the hip. He was unable to walk from loss of blood, but he felt that none of his wounds were very serious, and the surgeon said to him cheerfully, "You will do, lad. Your wounds are ugly to look at, but they are not serious. You will be on horseback again in another 10 days." Major Horsley had not spoken to him, but he had given him a little nod of satisfaction when the corporal gave his report. The cavalry moved across at a walk toward the wells of El Teb, the wounded being carried between the lines, as there was no saying how many Arabs might be lurking among the bushes. On reaching the wells they were taken to the field hospital, which had already been organized. There their wounds were more carefully examined and redressed, and after a drink of lime juice and water, with a little brandy in it, Edgar soon dropped off to sleep. In the morning Major Horsley and Captain Atkinson came round to see how the men of their regiment were getting on. The surgeon's report was favourable, except in the case of Corporal North. "I think he will pull round, Major, but I am sure he will never be fit for service again. That wound on the shoulder, which he tells me is the first he got, has cut clean through the collarbone and penetrated almost to the upper rib. I doubt whether he will ever have the use of his arm again, but that I cannot say. Anyhow, it will be long before it is fit for hard work. Trumpeter Smith, There is nothing serious the matter with him, but he has had a marvellous escape. If his helmet had not saved his head, the blow would have cleft right through his skull. If the wound in his cheek had been a couple of inches higher, it would have opened the temporal artery, and if the spear had penetrated instead of gliding off his ribs, that alone would have been sufficient to have done his business. As it is, he is not much the worse except for loss of blood, and with luck will be fit to take his place again in the ranks in a fortnight. "I am glad to hear so good an account of you, Smith," the major said as he went up to his bedside. "I have reported your conduct to General Stuart, and your name will be sent in among those recommended for the Victoria Cross. Mind, I don't say that you will get it, lad. I don't think you will, for so many men distinguished themselves yesterday in that hand-to-hand fight that the names sent in will be very much larger than the number of crosses given. Still, your having been recommended will count in your favour when the time comes." So saying, with a kindly nod, he moved on to the next bed. At 9 o'clock the force moved out towards Tokar, half the Gordon Highlanders being left at El Teb for the protection of the hospital and stores, and with orders to find and bury the Europeans that had fallen. During the day many of the Egyptian garrison of Tokar came into the camp from the surrounding villages. In the afternoon a mounted orderly brought in the news that the force had met with no resistance whatever on their way. Several parties of the enemy had been seen, but these fled as soon as they saw the troops advancing. In Tokar 70 of the Egyptian garrison were found in a half-starved condition. While their comrades had consented to join the Arabs, they had steadily refused to do so, and had been very badly treated in consequence by them and by the inhabitants of the town. The arrival of the troops was hailed with great joy. The inhabitants had had a terrible time during the occupation of the place by the Arabs, and the whole population were preparing to accompany the troops on their march back to the coast. The cavalry had ridden out to Deba, where the camp of the force besieging Tokar had been established. In the afternoon Edgar was so far recovered that he was able to sit up. His wounds were sore and painful, and the strapping of plaster in which they were enveloped rendered him very stiff and uncomfortable. But, as he said to another soldier, he had been just as stiff and sore after a football match, and felt confident that in a few days he should be as well as ever. The next morning the force returned from Tokar, and Edgar and the other troopers, who were well enough to go outside the hospital tent to see them come in, were amused at their appearance, for they had before starting armed themselves with spears taken from the fallen Arabs, for the fight on the previous day had shown them that their swords were of little avail against the tactics of the Arabs in throwing themselves flat upon the ground, and that spears were much better suited for warfare against savages. They were accompanied by the greater portion of the population of Tokar, who were to be conveyed in the ships up to Suakim. The cavalry had found that the Arabs had left the camp at Deba before they arrived. The expedition there was, however, by no means useless, for they found an immense quantity of rifles and ammunition, together with a Gatling and mountain gun, all of which had been captured by the Arabs at the rout of Baker Pasha's army, or at the destruction of the force under Colonel Moncrieff some months before. The guns captured in the entrenchments made up the complete number of those that had fallen into the hands of the natives on those two occasions, and so left them without artillery. The work of burying the dead had been carried on by the force left in camp, and by the aid of those who now returned was completed in a short time. No less than 1,000 Arabs were found to have fallen in and around their entrenchments, and numbers must have got away only to die subsequently from their wounds. It was learned from prisoners that Osman Digma had not himself been present at the battle, but had sent 1,000 men to reinforce those engaged in the siege of Tokar. The force now moved down to Trinkitat, with 300 men of the garrison of Tokar who had rejoined them, and 400 or 500 men, women, and children from that town. The re-embarkation was speedily effected, and a few hours later the ships entered Suakim harbour. It was found that the natives of that town had received the news of the victory of El Teb with absolute incredulity, but the arrival of the Tokar fugitives convinced them that the Arabs had really been defeated. One of the prisoners taken at Sinkat came in a day or two later, having made his escape from Osman Digma's camp. He reported that the news of the battle of El Teb had arrived there before he left, and that it had been given out that 7,000 of the English had been killed, and that it was only nightfall that saved them all from destruction. The first step of Admiral Hewitt and General Graham on their arrival at Suakim was to issue a proclamation calling upon all the tribesmen to leave Osman Digma and to come in and make their submission, promising protection and pardon to all who surrendered. This proclamation was backed by a letter from the Sheikh Morghani, who was held in the highest estimation for his holiness. He told them that God had sent the English to destroy them because they had forsaken the old religion for a new one, and entreated them to come in and make their peace. A fortnight had now passed since the fight at El Teb. Edgar, who had remained on board the hospital ship, had made rapid progress towards convalescence, and was now reported by the surgeons as fit to return to duty, which he was most anxious to do, as it was daily expected that the force would move out against Osman Digma, who was at Tamai, a place 16 miles to the southwest of Suakim. The troops had been disembarked, and he was delighted when he was again able to join his squadron. Spies came and went daily, and they were unanimous in saying that Osman would fight another battle. The news that El Teb was a disastrous defeat was by this time known, but his explanation that the misfortunes were solely due to his orders having been disobeyed perfectly satisfied his followers, and their belief that he was invincible was wholly unshaken. The most fanatical of the coast tribes still held to him, and on the 9th of March 21 of their sheiks sent in a defiant reply to the proclamation, saying that the 10,000 men they commanded would meet us in the field. It was therefore evident that the struggle to come would be much more serious and determined than that of El Teb. Edgar received quite an ovation upon rejoining his troop. The manner in which he had defended his wounded comrade had awakened their lively admiration, the more so since the man for whom he had so imperilled his life had but lately been his personal antagonist. "Well, young un, you are getting on," a sergeant said to him. "I won't say you are getting all the luck, for luck has nothing to do with it this time, anyhow. You are doing well, Smith, and it won't be many months before you are in our mess, and it needs no prophet to see that you have every chance of going higher if you keep on as you began. Here you are only about 17 years old, and you have made a big mark in the regiment already. You have got the major and the rest of the officers on your side from that affair at Aldershot. Then the fact that you are the best cricketer in the regiment counts for a lot. And now you have got wounded and have been recommended for the Victoria Cross. If you don't mount up after all that, it will be your own fault. You have every advantage. The fact that you have been a gentleman is in your favour, for naturally men are picked out for promotion who are best fitted for the position of officers, and your having been able to take a first-class certificate in the school in itself brings you into notice. Be careful with yourself, lad. I know you don't drink, so I need not warn you about that. Don't get cocky. I don't think you will, for you haven't done so at present, and the notice you have had from your cricket and that Aldershot affair would have turned a good many lads' heads. But it is a thing to be careful about. You know there are a good many old soldiers who are inclined to feel a little jealous when they see a young fellow pushing forward, but if they see he is quiet and gives himself no airs and is pleasant with everyone, they get over it in time. And in your case, everyone will acknowledge that you deserve all the luck that may fall to you. So be careful on that head, Smith. You will find very little jealousy among us sergeants when you once get into our mess, for there are very few of us who have any idea whatever of ever getting a commission, or would take one if it were offered. A sensible man knows when he is well off, and except for a man who has had the education you have had, one is much more comfortable as a sergeant, and better off, too, than one would be as an officer. When one is with other men who want to do as they do, and an officer who has got to live on his pay finds it hard work and painful work. Of course, most men promoted from the ranks, I mean my class of men, get quarter-masterships, but there is no great pull in that. Quartermasters are neither one thing nor the other. The officers may try to put him at his ease, but his ways are not their ways, and I have known many a quartermaster who, if he had his choice, would gladly come back to the sergeant's mess again. "Thank you for your advice, Sergeant," Edgar said quietly. "I will follow it to the best of my power. I don't think there is anything to be cocky about, for the thing at Aldershot was pure luck, and so it was the other day. I happened to be next to North when his horse fell, and of course I turned round to help him, without thinking who he was or anything about him. It was just instinct, and it hasn't done him any good after all, for I hear he is not likely to live many days." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of for Khartoum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. for Khartoum by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 8. Tamaniyab. "Are you sure you feel fit for active work again, Smith?" Major Horsley said as he met Edgar in camp. "Yes, sir," the lad said, saluting. "I am a little stiff, and it hurts me if I move suddenly, but I am sure I should not feel it if we were engaged again." "Well, do not do anything rash, lad. These fellows are not to be trifled with." That indeed was the general opinion in camp. The men were ready and eager for another fight with the enemy, but there was little of the light-hearted gaiety with which the contest had been anticipated before they had met the Arabs at El Teb. The idea that savages, however brave, could cope with British troops with breech-loaders had then seemed absurd. But the extraordinary bravery with which the Arabs had fought, the recklessness with which they threw away their lives, and the determination with which they had charged through a fire in which it seemed impossible that any human being could live, had created a feeling of respect. There was nothing contemptible about these foes, and it was expected that not only would the force be very much larger than that met at El Teb, but as it would be composed of Osman Digma's best men, and would be fighting under his eye, the battle would be much more hardly contested than before. The cavalry were particularly impressed with the formidable nature of these strange foemen. While they would have hurled themselves fearlessly against far superior forces of the best cavalry of Europe, they felt that here their discipline and mastery of their horses went for little. They could charge through any number of the enemy, but the danger lay not in the charge but after it. The Arab tactics of throwing themselves down only to stab the horses as they rode over them, and then rising up cutting and thrusting in their midst, were strange and bewildering to them. "I am game to charge a dozen squadrons of cavalry one after the other," a trooper said as they sat round the fire on the night of the 9th of March. "And if we had orders to go at a square of infantry, I should be ready to go, although I might not like the job. But as for these slippery black beggars, the less we have to do with them, the better I shall be pleased. You go at them, and you think you have got it all your own way, and then before you can say knife, there they are yelling and shouting and sticking those ugly spears into you and your horses, and dancing round until you don't fairly know what you are up to. There ain't nothing natural or decent about it." There was a general murmur of assent. "We shall know more about their ways next time," another said, "but lancers would be the best for this sort of work. There is no getting at these beggars on the ground with our swords, for the horses will always leap over a body, and so you cannot reach them with your swords, but a lance would do the business well. I don't care much for lances for regular work, but for this sort of fighting there is no doubt they are the real thing. Well, there is one thing, if we get among the niggers this time, we know what we have got to deal with, and up or down there will be no mercy shown." On the 10th the Royal Highlanders marched out 6 miles towards Tamai, and formed an encampment there, defending it with bushes interlaced with wire, this kind of defence being known among the natives as a zareba. The next afternoon the rest of the infantry marched out and joined them. Next morning the cavalry moved out, and in the afternoon the whole force started, the cavalry thrown out ahead. A few shots were exchanged with parties of the enemy, but there was no serious fighting. The march was slow, for the ground was thickly covered with bushes, through which the troops with the ambulance and commissariat camels moved but slowly. The sailors had very hard work dragging their guns through the deep sand, and it took 4 hours before they reached a spot suitable for encampment, within 2 miles of the enemy's position. The spot selected for the halt was a space free from bushes, and large enough to afford room for the encampment, and to leave a clear margin of some 50 yards wide between it and the bushes. As soon as the column halted, the cavalry and part of the infantry took up their position as outposts to prevent a surprise on the part of the enemy, and the rest set to work to cut down bushes and drag them across the sand to form a fresh zareba. When this was completed, the cavalry trotted back to the post held on the previous night, as they would be useless in case of a night attack, and their horses might suffer from a distant fire of the enemy. Inside the zareba the greatest vigilance was observed. Fully 10,000 determined enemies lay but a short distance away, and might creep up through the bushes and make a sudden onslaught at any time. The moon was full, and its light would show any object advancing across the open space. Had it not been for this, the general would not have been justified in encamping at so short a distance from the enemy. The march had been a short one, but the heat had been great and the dust terrible, and the troops threw themselves down on the ground exhausted when the work of constructing the zareba was completed. But after a short rest they took up their posts in readiness to repel an attack. During the early part of the night all remained under arms, but Commander Rolfe of the Royal Navy crept out at the rear of the camp, gained the bushes, and crawled among them until he came within sight of the enemy. He saw them in great numbers sitting round their fires or stretched upon the ground, and returned to camp with the news that whatever might be the case later on, certainly no attack was meditated at present. The greater part of the troops were thereupon allowed to lie down and get what sleep they could. The cavalry felt much anxiety respecting those they had left behind them, but the moon was sufficiently bright to permit signals to be flashed to them from the camp, and they learnt to their satisfaction that all was quiet. Soon after 1 o'clock in the morning, the stillness round the zareba was suddenly broken. A roar of musketry burst from the bushes all round, and it was evident that the enemy were assembled there in great force. The troopers were ordered to lie down, and fortunately here, as at El Teb, the Arab fire was far too high, and the storm of bullets swept for the most part overhead. Many of the camels, mules, and horses were, however, hit, but only 1 man was killed, and an officer and 2 men wounded. Grasping their rifles, the troops lay ready to spring to their feet and repel the attack should it be made. But the hours passed on slowly, without the expected movement taking place, and there was a general feeling of relief when morning at last broke. As the Arabs continued their fire, a 9-pounder and Gatling gun were brought into play upon the bushes, and the fire of the enemy soon died out, and they fell back to their camp. The troops now had breakfast, and soon after they had finished, the cavalry arrived from the other zareba. At 8 o'clock the mounted infantry moved out, accompanied by a party of Abyssinian scouts. They had gone but a short distance when a very heavy fire was opened upon them, and the officer in command sent back to the general to say that there was a broad ravine stretching across the country a few hundred yards ahead, although hidden by the bushes from observation until closely approached, and that this ravine was held by the enemy in great force. The infantry now moved out from the zareba, formed in 2 squares. The 2nd Brigade, composed of the Royal Highlanders, the 65th, and the Marines, led the way. It was commanded by General Davis, and in the centre rode General Graham with his staff. As soon as this had marched out, the 1st Brigade followed, taking its place in echelon 100 yards on its right rear, so that its fire commanded its right flank and protected it from an attack in the rear. It consisted of the 89th, 75th, and 60th Rifles, under General Buller. The camels and baggage animals remained under a guard at the zareba. The mounted infantry and Abyssinians fell back as the 1st Brigade advanced, and as soon as they had moved clear of the face of the square, the machine guns at its angles opened fire. The enemy's fire soon ceased, and the brigade again advanced, but the Arabs had simply thrown themselves down and had not retreated, and their fire broke out again as soon as that of the machine guns ceased. General Graham now gave the order for the Highlanders, who formed the front face of the square, to charge. With a cheer they went forward at the double, and sweeping the enemy before them, soon reached the head of the ravine. The result of the order was, however, that the square was broken up. Its front face had moved on at a run, while the flanks and rear had continued their march at the same pace as before, and there was consequently a wide gap between the 65th on the right flank and the Highlanders in front. Orders were given to the 65th to hurry up, but as they did so, masses of the enemy were seen coming on at a run and making for the gap in the square. The right companies of the 65th tried to form up to meet them, while Lieutenant Graham, R.N., with the men of the Naval Brigade working the 3 machine guns under his command, threw himself into the gap. But the yells of the enemy and the roar of musketry rendered it impossible for the men to hear the orders given, and before the 65th had formed up, the enemy were close at hand. Their fire and that of the Gatlings mowed down the Arabs in hundreds, but the wild mob charged on. Some hurled themselves onto the 65th, others poured like a wave over the little group of sailors, while the rest, dashing through the gap, flung themselves on the rear of the 42nd. The sergeants, whose place is in rear of the men, were cut down almost to a man, and the rear rank facing round were at once engaged in a desperate hand-to-hand fight with the natives. All was now confusion. Fresh masses of the enemy poured down with exulting shouts, and in a confused crowd the brigade retreated. Had not help been at hand, they would probably have met with the same fate that befell Baker's force, and none would have reached Suakim to tell the news of the massacre. The sailors, in vain trying to drag off their guns, were almost all killed, and the guns fell into the hands of the enemy. But a check was given to the advance of the Arabs by the cavalry, who had moved forward to the left of the square. The officer in command saw that were he to charge against the broken ground, his little force would be lost among the throng of Arabs. He therefore dismounted them, and they poured volley after volley with their carbines into the thick of the enemy. In the meantime, General Buller's square was advancing. It had been attacked as desperately as had that of General Davis, but it was well handled, and its formation had not been broken up by any order such as that which had destroyed the formation of the other brigade. So steady and terrible a fire was opened upon the advancing enemy that not one of the assailants reached the face of the square, and having repulsed the attacks, it advanced rapidly to the relief of the shattered brigade ahead, pouring incessant volleys into the ranks of the Arabs as they swept down to its assault. Thus, as they advanced, the first brigade cleared the right face of the second from its foes, and as soon as they came up with the retreating force, these halted and reformed their ranks. Both brigades were now formed in line, and advanced steadily towards the ravine. Upon their way they came upon the abandoned guns, which the enemy had in vain tried to carry off. Sweeping the Arabs before them, the British force reached the edge of the ravine. It was filled by the flying Arabs, and into these a terrible fire was poured by the musketry and guns until the Arabs had gained the opposite side and were concealed among the bushes. The fighting was now over, although the enemy still maintained a distant fire. It was necessary, however, to keep the troops together, for numbers of the Arabs still lay hidden among the bushes, leaping up and flinging themselves desperately upon any one who approached them. The scene of the conflict was terrible. 120 of the British lay dead, of whom more than half belonged to the 42nd. 3 naval officers and 10 sailors were killed, while a large number of officers and men of the 42nd and 65th were seriously wounded. The slaughter among the natives had been very great, no less than 4,000 of them strewing the ground in all directions. The British wounded were sent back to the zareba, and the force again advanced. Crossing the ravine, they made towards 3 villages in its rear. Here was Osman Digma's camp, and the Arabs mustering in strength again opened a heavy fire. They were, however, unable to withstand the British guns and the heavy volleys of the infantry, and the troops advanced into the camp. It was found filled with property of all kinds, for the Arabs had removed nothing, making perfectly sure that they should be able to repel the English advance. Bags of money, bundles of clothing, Korans, great quantities of grain, and plunder of all kinds were found in the huts. Osman Digma himself had taken no part whatever in the fight. He had looked on from a distant eminence, and when he saw the repulse of the Arab attack and the flight of his men, he at once made off. The next day the cavalry went on to a village 2 or 3 miles distant. Here they found a great quantity of ammunition for Krupp cannon and other loot, which had been captured from the forces of Baker and Moncrief. The village was burnt and the ammunition blown up. The next day the force started on its return march. After burning and destroying Osman's camp and the 3 adjoining villages, no attempt was made to pursue Osman Digma or his Arabs. The country beyond was steep and mountainous, and there would have been no chance whatever of overtaking and capturing him, while the troops might have been attacked in difficult positions and have suffered heavily. It was supposed that after the 2 crushing defeats that had been inflicted on the enemy, and the proof so afforded of the falsehood of Osman Digma's pretensions, the tribesmen would no longer believe in him, and that his authority would have been altogether destroyed. The expectation was not, however, justified by events, for 2 years later the Arabs again mustered under him in such formidable numbers that another expedition was necessary to protect Suakim against the gathering of fanatics reassembled under Osman's banner. The cavalry had suffered no loss during the operations, and as they had had some share in the fighting and had materially aided the shattered brigade by their fire upon the Arabs, they were not ill satisfied that they had not been called upon to take a more prominent part in the operations. But little time was lost at Suakim. The greater part of the troops were at once embarked on the transports and taken up to Suez, a small body only being left to protect the town should the Arabs again gather in force. The policy was a short-sighted one. Had a protectorate been established over the country to the foot of the hills, and a force sufficient to maintain it left there, the great bulk of the tribesmen would have willingly given in their allegiance, and no further hostile movement upon the part of Osman Digma would have been possible. But the fact that we hastened away after fighting, and afforded no protection whatever to the friendly natives, effectually deterred others from throwing in their lot with us, and enabled Osman Digma gradually to restore his power and influence among them. Short though the campaign had been, it had the effect of causing some inflammation in Edgar's wounds, and as soon as the expedition returned to the coast, the surgeon ordered him into hospital, and it was 6 weeks before he again took his place in the ranks. By this time the regiment was reunited at Cairo, and there was for some months nothing to break the even tenor of their way. Long ere this, Edgar had learnt that his recommendation for the Victoria Cross had not been acceded to. This, however, was no surprise, for after what he had heard from Major Horsley, he had entertained but little hope that he would be among the favoured recipients of the cross. "Never mind, Ned," a comrade said to him when the list was published, and his name was found to be absent. "It is not always those that most deserve the cross who get it. We know that you ought to have had it, if any fellow ever did, and we shall think just as much of you as if you had got it on your breast." In spite of the heat, cricket matches were got up at Cairo, and the Hussars distinguished themselves here as they had done at Aldershot. The chief topic of interest, however, was the question of the safety of Khartoum, and especially that of General Gordon. He had been sent out by the British government in hopes that the great influence he possessed among the natives might enable him to put a stop to the disorder that prevailed in the Soudan. At the time that he had been in the service of the Egyptian government, he had ruled so wisely and well in the Soudan that his prestige among the natives was enormous. He had suppressed slave trading and restored order throughout the wide province, and by mingling mercy with justice, he was at once admired and feared even by those whose profits had been annihilated by the abolition of the slave trade. But although Gordon had been rapturously received by the inhabitants of Khartoum, the tribes of the Soudan had not rallied, as it was hoped they would do, in opposition to the Mahdi, whose armies had gradually advanced, and had besieged the city. General Gordon, with the troops there, had made expeditions up the river in the steamers, and brought in provisions for the besieged town. He had fought several battles with the Mahdists, in which he had not always been successful, and it was known that unless help arrived the city must finally surrender. Many letters had been received from him asking urgently for aid, but weeks and months passed, and the government who had sent him out were unable to make up their minds to incur the cost necessary for the dispatch of so distant an expedition. In Cairo public feeling ran very high, and among the troops there the indignation at this base desertion of one of England's noblest soldiers was intense and general. At last the news came that public feeling in England had become so strong that government could no longer resist it, and that orders had been issued to prepare an expedition with all haste. A number of flatboats were to be built for conveying the troops up the Nile. Canadian boatmen had been sent for to aid in the navigation of the river. Camels were to be purchased in Egypt, a mounted infantry corps organized, and stores of all kinds hastily collected. People who knew the river shook their heads and said that the decision had been delayed too long. The Nile would have fallen to a point so low that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to pass up the cataracts, and long before help could reach Khartoum, the city and its noble governor would have fallen into the hands of the Mahdi. There was much disgust among the troops when it was known that many of them would remain in Lower Egypt, and that of the cavalry especially but a very small force would be taken, while 3 regiments mounted on camels, 2 of them consisting of cavalrymen from England, would take part in the expedition. Some of the soldiers, however, looked at the matter more philosophically. "We have had our share," they argued, "and if the Mahdi's men fight as well as Osman Digma's, we are quite willing that others should have their whack. There will be no end of hard work, and what fighting they get won't be all one way. Sand and heat and preserved meat and dirty water out of wells are not very pleasant when you have to stick to them for months together. Like enough, too, there will be another rumpus down at Suakim while the expedition is away, and then those who are left here now will get some more of it." But although these arguments were loudly uttered, there was no doubt that there was considerable soreness, and that the men felt the hardship of favoured troops from England being employed in their stead in a service that, if dangerous, was likely to offer abundant opportunities for the display of courage and for gaining credit and honour. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Dash for Khartoum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Dash for Khartoum by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 9. The Camel Corps. "Trumpeter Smith! Trumpeter Smith!" The shout ran through the arched corridor of the barracks, and a soldier, putting his head through one of the windows, repeated the cry at the top of his voice, for Trumpeter Smith was not in his barrack room. Edgar, in fact, was walking on the shady side of the great courtyard, chatting with two other troopers, when his name was shouted. "Hello! What is it?" "You are to go to Major Horsley's quarters." Edgar buttoned up his jacket, ran to the washing place, plunged his head and hands in water and hastily dried them, smoothed down his hair with his pocket comb at a piece of looking glass that had been stuck up against the wall above the basins, and adjusting his cap to the correct angle, made his way to Major Horsley's quarters, wondering much what he could be wanted for, but supposing that he was to be sent on some message into the town. The soldier servant showed him into the room where Major Horsley and his wife were sitting. After a word or two of kindly greeting from the lady, Major Horsley went on. "I told you a long time back, Smith, that I should not forget the service you did my wife and her sister, and that I would do you a good turn if ever I got the chance. Is there anything you particularly want at present?" "No, sir, except that I have been thinking that I should be glad to give up my trumpet. I am just 18 now, and it would be better for me, I think, to take my regular place in the ranks. I should be more likely to be promoted there than I am as a trumpeter." "Yes, you would be sergeant in a very short time, Smith. After your behaviour at El Teb, you would be sure of your stripes as soon as you were eligible for them. But I should not advise you to give up your trumpet just at the present moment." "Very well, sir," Edgar said, somewhat surprised. "But there is something else you are wishing for, is there not? I fancy every officer and man in the regiment is wishing for it." "To go up the Nile, sir?" Edgar asked eagerly. "Yes, I do wish that, indeed. Is there any chance of the regiment going, sir?" "No, I am sorry to say there is not," the major said. "And a very good thing too, Richard," his wife put in. "I do not think so at all. It is the hardest thing ever heard of that the regiments here that have had all the heat and hard work and everything else of this beastly place are to be left behind while the fellows from England go on. Well, Smith," he went on, turning to Edgar, "I am glad to say I have been able to do you a good turn. When I was in the orderly room just now, a letter came to the colonel from the general saying that a trumpeter of the heavy camel corps is down with sunstroke and will not be able to go, and requesting him to detail a trumpeter to take his place. I at once seized the opportunity and begged that you might be chosen, saying that I owed you a good turn for your plucky conduct at Aldershot. The adjutant, I am glad to say, backed me up, saying that you have done a lot of credit to the regiment with your cricket, and that the affair at El Teb alone ought to single you out when there was a chance like this going. The colonel rather thought that you were too young, but we urged that as you had stood the climate at Suakim, you could stand it anywhere on the face of the globe. So you are to go, and the whole regiment will envy you." "I am obliged to you indeed, sir," Edgar said in delight. "I do not know how to thank you, sir." "I do not want any thanks, Smith, for a service that has cost me nothing. Now you are to go straight to Sergeant Edmonds. I have sent him a note already, and he is to set the tailors at work at once to rig you out in the khaki uniform. We cannot get you the helmet they are fitted out with, but no doubt they have got a spare one or two. Probably they will let you have the helmet of the man whose place you are to take. You will be in orders tomorrow morning, and I have asked Edmonds to get your things all finished by that time. Come in and say good-bye before you start in the morning." There was no slight feeling of envy when Edgar's good fortune became known, and the other trumpeters were unanimous in declaring that it was a shame his being chosen. "Well, you see, you could not all go," the trumpet major said, "and if Smith had not been chosen, it would have been long odds against each of you." "But he is the last joined of the lot," one of the men urged. "He can blow a trumpet as well as any of you," the sergeant said, "and that is what he is wanted for." "I think that it is natural enough the colonel should give him the pull. The officers think a good deal of a fellow who helped the regiment to win a dozen matches at cricket, and who carried off the long-distance running prize at Aldershot. Besides, he behaved uncommonly well in that fight, and has as good a right to the V.C. as any man there. I think that a fellow like that ought to have the pull, if only one is to get it, and I am sure the whole regiment will be of opinion that he has deserved the chance he has got." By the next morning the suit of khaki was ready, and Edgar was sent for early to the orderly room and officially informed by the colonel that he had been detailed for service in the heavy Camel Corps. "I need not tell you, Smith, to behave yourself well, to be a credit to the regiment. I should not have chosen you for the service unless I felt perfectly confident that you would do that. I hope that you will come back again safe and sound with the regiment. Good-bye, lad." Edgar saluted and left the room. Several of the officers followed him out and bade him a cheery farewell, for he was a general favourite. All knew that he was a gentleman, and hoped that he would some day win a commission. He then accompanied Major Horsley to his quarters, and there the officer and his wife both shook hands with him warmly. "You will be a sergeant 3 months after you come back," Major Horsley said, "and your having been on this Nile expedition and your conduct at El Teb will help you on when the time comes, and I hope you will be one of us before many years are over." Edgar then went up to his barrack room to say good-bye to his friends, and took off his smart hussar uniform and put on the khaki suit, amid much laughter and friendly chaff at the change in his appearance. The adjutant had ordered a trooper to accompany him to the camp of the Camel Corps, which was pitched close by the pyramids, and to bring back his horse. He therefore mounted and rode out of the barracks, amid many a friendly farewell from his comrades. He rode with his companion into the town and down to the river, crossed in a ferry boat, and then rode on to the camp. Inquiring for the adjutant's tent, Edgar dismounted and walked up to that officer and presented a note from the colonel. The officer glanced at it. "Oh, you have come to accompany us," he said. "You look very young for the work, lad, but I suppose your colonel would not have chosen you unless he thought you could stand it. I see you have got our uniform, but you want a helmet. We can manage that for you. Sergeant Jefferson, see if Trumpeter Johnson's helmet will fit this man. He is going with us in his place. Fit him out with water bottle and accoutrements, and tell him off to a tent." The helmet fitted fairly, and only needed a little padding to suit Edgar, who, after putting it on, ran out to where his comrade was waiting for him, and fastened his own headgear to the pummel of his saddle. "Good-bye, young un," the trooper said. Hold your own with these heavies for the honour of the regiment. They mean well, you know, so don't be too hard upon them." Edgar laughed as he shook the man by the hand, and as he rode off, turned to look at the scene around him. There were two camps at a short distance from each other, that of the heavy camel corps to which he now belonged, composed of men of the 1st and 2nd Life Guards, Blues, Bays, 4th and 5th Dragoon Guards, Royals, Scots Greys, 5th and 16th Lancers. The other was the Guards Corps, composed of men of the 3 regiments of Foot Guards. Edgar's first feeling as he looked at the men who were standing about or lying in the shade of the little triangular Indian Mountain Service tents was that he had suddenly grown smaller. He was fully up to the average height of the men of his own regiment, but he felt small indeed by the side of the big men of the heavy cavalry regiments. "This way, lad," the sergeant into whose charge he had been given said. "What is your name?" "I am down as Ned Smith." The sergeant smiled at the answer, for no inconsiderable number of men enlist under false names. He led the way through the little tents until he stopped before one where a tall soldier was lying at full length on the sand. "Wilcox, this man has come to take the place of Trumpeter Johnson. He is detached for duty with us from the Hussars. He will, of course, share your tent." "All right, sergeant. I will put him up to the ropes. What's your name, mate?" "I go as Ned Smith," Edgar said. "So you are going in for being a heavy at present. I don't care whether I am a heavy or a light, so that I can go up the river." "Have you been out here long?" "About a year. We were through the fighting at Suakim, you know." "It was pretty hot down there, I can tell you." "It is hot enough here for me, a good deal too hot, in fact, and as for the dust, it is awful." "Yes, it is pretty dusty out here," Edgar agreed, "and of course with these little tents the wind and dust sweep right through them. Over there in Cairo we have comfortable barracks, and as we keep close during the day we don't feel the heat. Besides, it is getting cooler now. In August it was really hot for a bit even there." "Where are we going to get these camels, do you know?" "Up the river at Assouan, I believe, but I don't know very much about it. It was only yesterday afternoon I got orders that I was to go with you, to take the place of one of your men who had fallen sick, so I have not paid much attention as to what was going on. It has been rather a sore subject with us, you see. It did seem very hard that the regiments here that have stood the heat and dust of this climate all along should be left behind now that there is something exciting to do, and that fresh troops from England should go up. Well, I should not like it myself, lad. Still, I am precious glad I got the chance. I am one of the 5th Dragoon Guards, and you know we don't take a turn of foreign service, though why we shouldn't I am sure I don't know. And we are precious glad to get a chance from Aldershot and Birmingham and Brighton and all those home stations. You are a lot younger than any of us here. The orders were that no one under 22 was to come." "So I heard, but of course as we are out here and we have got accustomed to it, age makes no difference." "What do they send us out here for?" "There are no barracks empty in the town. No open spaces where you could be comfortably encamped nearer. Besides, this gives you the chance of seeing the pyramids." "It is a big lump of stone, isn't it?" Wilcox said, staring at the Great Pyramid. "The chaps who built that must have been very hard up for a job. When I first saw it I was downright disappointed. Of course I had heard a lot about it, and when we got here it wasn't half as big as I expected. After we had pitched our tents and got straight, 2 or 3 of us thought we would climb to the top, as we had half an hour to spare. Just as we set off, one of the officers came along and said, 'Where are you going, lads?' And I said, 'The cooks won't have tea ready for half an hour, sir, so we thought we would just get up to the top and look around.' And he said, 'If you do, you will be late for tea.' Well, it didn't seem to us as if it would take more than 5 minutes to get to the top, and as much to get down again, so off we went. But directly we began to climb, we found the job was not as easy as we had expected. It looked to us as if there was but 100 steps to go up, but each step turned out to be about 5 feet high, and we hadn't got up above 20 of them when the trumpet sounded, and we pretty near broke our necks in coming down again. After that, I got more respect for that lump of stone. Most of the officers went up next day, and a few of us did manage it, but I wasn't one of them. I did try again, but I concluded that if I wanted to go up the Nile and to be of any good when I got there, I had best give it up, for there would not be anything left of me to speak of by the time I got to the top. Then those Arab fellows got round and shrieked and jabbered and wanted to pull us up, and the way they go up and down those stones is wonderful. But of course they have no weight to carry. No, I never should try that job again, not if we were to be camped here for the next 10 years. I have been up to the top, Edgar said, but it is certainly a hard pull, and there is nothing much to see when you do get there, only so much more sand in all directions. The view from the great mosque at Cairo is much finer. Do you have much drill? Morning and evening we work away pretty stiff. It is infantry drill we have. They say we are not going to fight on the camels, but only to be carried along by them, and to get off and fight if we see the enemy, and as we are all new to each other, there is a good bit of work to be done to get us down to work as one battalion. We and the 4th make a troop together. We have drill in the afternoon, too, for a bit. Of a morning, those that like can go across and have a look at the town. I went yesterday. Rum old place, isn't it? The rummiest thing is the way those little donkeys get about, with a fat chap perched on the top of a saddle 2 feet above them. Never saw such mokes in my life. They aren't bigger than good-sized dogs, some of them, and yet they go along with 15 or 16 stone on their backs, as if they did not feel it. Those and the camels pleased me most. Rum beasts, those camels. I can't think what it must feel like to be stuck up on top of them, and if one does fall off, it must be like coming off a church. Have you tried one? No, I have never been on a camel. Of course, we always have had our horses. Why didn't they get us horses? I don't know. They could have bought a couple of thousand, no doubt, if they had tried. Besides, they could have got some from the Egyptian cavalry. But if they had, they would never have sent out you and the guards, though the horses would have done very well to carry light cavalry. I fancy the idea is that in the first place we have to go long distances without water. Camels can stand thirst for 3 or 4 days together, and each camel can carry water for its rider. Then, too, we may perhaps march sometimes, and the camels could carry water and food. So, you see, they will be useful both ways. Well, I suppose it is all right, Wilcox said, and as you say, if they had gone in for horses, they could not have carried us heavies. I am precious glad to come. So are we all, though why they wanted to bring us and the guards, the biggest and heaviest men they could pick out in the army, on a job like this, is more than I can say. It is more than anyone can say, I should think, Edgar said. And indeed, no reason has ever been assigned for the singular choice of the heaviest men that could be collected in the service for duty on a campaign such as this was to be, and for which light, active, wiry men were especially suitable. There is the dinner call. What troop are we in? Edgar asked, seizing his trumpet, and on learning at once gave the troop call. We are in messes of 8, Wilcox replied. We and the 3 tents to the right have one mess. It is our turn to go over and get the grub. Accordingly, Wilcox and Edgar went across to the field kitchen and received the rations for their mess, consisting of beef and vegetables. The bread for the day had been served out early. Returning to the tents, the rations were divided between the party of 8, and Edgar was introduced by Wilcox to his new messmates. Your regiment was at Aldershot with us 18 months ago. Yes, but I did not know any of your men. I was over 1 or 2 evenings at your canteen, which was by a long way the best in the camp. "Yes, we used to have some good singing there, and no mistake," one of the men said. "The Long Valley is not bad in the way of dust, but this place beats it hollow," another put in. "This is a cleaner dust," Edgar said. "The Long Valley dust blackened one. This does not seem to have any dirt in it. As far as the uniforms go, there is not much difference, but one doesn't feel so grimy after a charge over this Egyptian sand as one did in the Long Valley." "We played you fellows at cricket, I remember," the man said. "I was in our 11. You beat us, for you had a youngster we could not stand up against. He was a beggar to bowl." Edgar laughed. "I rather think I am the fellow," he said. "Trumpeter Smith." "It was Trumpeter Smith, sure enough. Well, you can bowl, and no mistake, young un. It is rum meeting out here like this. And how have you been getting on since? You fellows were in the thick of it at El Tab, I saw, and got cut up a bit by those niggers, didn't you?" "That we did," Edgar replied. "I am not sorry that we are going to fight as infantry this time, for I can tell you it is not pleasant charging among fellows who throw themselves down and hamstring your horse or drive a spear into him as he passes over them, and once down it is likely to go pretty hard with you. The infantry had it pretty hot too at Tamanieb. Yes, they got into one of our squares, and I don't think many of our fellows would have ever got away if it had not been that Buller's square came up to their assistance. Still, I don't suppose that will ever happen again. If the infantry stand firm and shoot straight, they ought never to be broken, while that cavalry business was a thing nothing could guard against. The best horseman in the world may go down if a fellow shams dead and then suddenly stabs your horse." "There is no doubt the beggars can fight," Wilcox said, "and I expect we shall get some tough work before we get to Khartoum. I only hope they won't catch us suddenly before we have time to get off those camels. Fancy being stuck up on one of these long-legged beasts, with half a dozen niggers making a cock-shy of you with their spears." "I don't think that will happen," Edgar replied. "We shall have the 19th to act as scouts, and as there will be no woods or thick scrub, from what I have heard of the country, as there was on the plains around Suakim, we ought not to be surprised." "This meat is horribly tough," Wilcox remarked. "It strikes me they ought to have examined everyone's mouth before they sent them out, and to have chosen men with good sets of grinders, for I am sure they will want them for this stuff." "The meat is tough out here. You see it won't keep, and has to be cooked pretty nearly warm. But it is better by a long way than that tinned meat which is all we shall get, I expect, when we once start." "When are we going to start?" "In a few days, I should think. The boats are being taken up fast, and I believe a lot of the Canadians went up yesterday. There are 2 or 3 infantry regiments up there ready to go on as soon as the boats for them get up, and as most of the camels are up there too, I should think they will push us up as soon as they can, as I suppose we are intended to go ahead of the boats and clear the banks." Then they began to talk about the route, and Edgar, who had studied the maps and knew all that there was known on the subject of the journey, drew on the sand the course of the Nile and its windings and turnings. "You see, the river makes a tremendous bend here," he said, "round by Berber. The general idea is that when we get to this spot, where there is a place called Ambukol, if there is news that Gordon is hard pressed and cannot hold out long, a column will march across this neck to Medameh, where there are some of Gordon's steamers. I expect that is the work that will fall to the Camel Corps, and that it is especially for this that we have been got up. You see, the rest of the journey is along the water side, and horses would have done just as well as camels, and would be much more useful, for, of course, the infantry will do the main fighting, and the cavalry are only wanted for scouting and pursuit. Camels are no good for either one work or the other, for nothing will persuade the beggars to move out of their regular pace, which is just about 2 3/4 miles an hour. If they did not intend to cut across this neck, I don't see what they wanted more than the boats with the infantry and a regiment or two of light cavalry on these country horses, which are wonderfully hardy and can stand work that would knock English horses to pieces in no time. Well, then, all that I can say is, Wilcox put in, that it is very lucky for us that the river makes that big twist. Otherwise, we might all be kicking our heels at Aldershot, or the Curragh, or in some garrison town. But I thought camels were fast beasts. I am sure I have seen pictures of Arabs riding about in the desert at a tremendous pace. There are some sort of camels called riding camels that are faster than the others, and there are dromedaries which can trot as fast as a horse and keep it up for a long time. But the riding camels and dromedaries are both scarce and expensive, and you may be sure we shall not have many of them with us. They are beastly ill-tempered looking brutes, Wilcox said. When I was walking in the streets there the other day, a string of them came along, and they grumbled and growled like wild beasts, and one showed his teeth and made as if he was going right at me. If I had not jumped into a shop, I believe he would have had my ear off. They can bite, and bite very hard too, but it is very seldom they do, though they do make a wonderful pretense of being fierce. They call them the patient camel, but from what I have seen of them, I should say that they are the most impatient, grumbling beasts in creation. It makes no difference what you do for them, whether you load them or unload them, or tell them to get up or lie down, or to go on or stop. They always seem equally disgusted, and grumble and growl as if what you wanted them to do was the hardest thing in the world. Still, they can do a tremendous lot of work, and keep on any number of hours, and I don't know what the people of this country would do without them. In the afternoon, Edgar paraded with his troop, and fell into the usual routine of duty. As he had had a year's campaigning in Egypt, he was regarded as an authority, and after 3 or 4 days was as much at home with the troop as he had been in his own regiment. He found these big men very pleasant and cheery companions. All had been picked for the service, as being men of exemplary character. They were in high spirits at the prospect of the expedition before them, and were like a party of great schoolboys out on a holiday. They took to Edgar kindly. Belonging as he did to the light cavalry, they regarded him as a sort of guest among them, and from his being so much younger and smaller than themselves, they looked upon him as a boy, and he quickly got the nickname of the Kid. Many questions were asked him as to the fighting powers of the wild natives. "How they could break right into a square beats me altogether," one of the big troopers said. "They always tell us that cavalry have no chance nowadays of breaking into a square, for they would all be shot down by the breech-loaders before they could reach it, and yet these niggers, with nothing but spears, manage to do it. I cannot make head or tail of it. No more I can of you chaps getting cut up by them." "You will understand it when you see it," Edgar said. "They run pretty nearly as fast as a horse can gallop, and they don't seem to fear death in the slightest, for they believe that if they are killed they go straight to heaven. It seems to me that savages must be braver than civilized soldiers. It was the same thing with the Zulus, you know. They came right down on our men at Isandula, and the fire of the breech-loaders did not stop them in the slightest. No more it would stop us, young 'un, if we got orders to charge. It did not at Balaclava." "No, that is true enough," Edgar agreed. "But then we have got discipline. The order is given, and the whole regiment goes off together. One could not hold back if one would. But that is a different thing from rushing forward each man on his own account, as they did against us, and running up to what seemed certain death. I know the feeling among our fellows was that they would not have believed it had they not seen it." "Well, I hope we shall get a chance of seeing it," the man said. "Only I hope that we shall not be atop of them camels when they try it. I have been looking at the beasts over there in the city, and there does not seem to me to be any go about them. Beastly tempered brutes. I don't believe you could get a charge out of them if you tried ever so much." "No, I don't think you could," Edgar laughed. "But you see, we are intended to fight on foot. We shall be like the old dragoons, who used their horses only to carry them to the place where they were to fight." "No chance of any loot?" another put in. "No chance in the world. At the best of times they wear a sort of dirty cotton sheet round their shoulders, but when they go into battle they leave that behind them, and fight only in their loin cloths." "I have heard," an old soldier said, "from some of our chaps who fought in the Indian Mutiny, that they often found a lot of money and jewels and things in those loin cloths of the sepoys." "Ah, that was because they had been plundering treasuries and capturing booty of all sorts. But I do not suppose that many of these Arabs ever saw a gold coin in their lives. They don't see many silver ones. What wealth they have is in sheep and cattle and horses, and with these they barter for such things as they require. No, if you are fighting out here for a year, you will get nothing except a few worthless charms of no value whatever, except as curios." "Well, I wish they would let us be off," another said. "I am sick already of these sands and that big lump of stone. I hear the boats are going up every day, and if they do not move us soon, the infantry will be there before us." "I think we shall travel a good deal faster than they do when we are once off," Edgar said. "They will have rapids and all sorts of difficulties to contend with, while we shall go on steadily, 25 miles a day perhaps. You may be sure we shall be well in front when the time for work comes. They would never go to the expense of sending you all out and mounting you on camels, and then keep you behind." "Have you heard the news, lads?" a sergeant asked, joining the group. "No, what is it?" "We are to strike tents at 4 o'clock this afternoon, march down to the river, embark in a steamer, and start tonight." "Hooray!" the men shouted. "That is the best news we have had since we landed." In a short time most of the men were at work giving a final polish to their arms. By 4 o'clock the tents were levelled and rolled up, the baggage was packed and sent forward on camels, and the regiment was formed up, awaiting the orders to march. The heat of the day had somewhat abated, but the march, short as it was a trying one, from the clouds of light sand that rose from beneath the feet of the column, and the men were heartily glad when they embarked, 2 troops on board the steamer, and the rest on large flats which she was to tow up the stream. Kits and belts were taken off, and the men made themselves as comfortable as the crowded state of the flats would permit. The officers were on board the steamer. As they started, a loud cheer broke from the men. They were fairly off at last. There was no thought of the dangers and difficulties before them. It was enough for them that they were fairly on their way up the Nile to relieve, as they hoped, Khartoum, and to rescue Gordon. "If this is campaigning, I don't care how much we have of it," the soldier who was sitting next to Edgar said, looking up at the deep blue sky studded with stars. "This suits me down to the ground." "You had better make the most of it," Edgar laughed. "It won't last long, and you will have nothing like it again. I own that, at any rate until we reach the highest point to which the boats can go, I think the infantry have got the best of it. Of course they will have hard work in hauling the boats past the rapids, and they will have some rowing to do when the wind is too light for the sails to carry them up, but I would rather sit in a boat and row than sit on the back of a camel." "But the boats will go all the way, won't they?" "It is not known yet. It is possible that when we get to a place named Korti, where the river makes a tremendous bend, some of us may cross the desert to Metemmeh, where Gordon's steamers will meet us. If we do, I expect that will be the work of the 3 camel corps, and all the boats will go right around the river and join us there. That is, if they can get up the cataracts. I know the Egyptians say the water will be too low for the boats to go up. That may be true enough as to the native boats, but ours draw so little water that I believe there must always be depth enough for them, for there is always a good lot of water coming down here even at the driest season. The regiment was disembarked at Assuan, and the next day 4 companies went up in 2 steamers to Wadi Halfa, 180 miles higher up the river. Edgar's troop formed part of the detachment. They had expected to see a place of some size, but found that it consisted only of a few mud huts and some sheds of the unfinished railway. Here, for some days, the men practiced infantry drill and received their equipments and saddles, and then they were marched to a camel depot a mile away. The soldiers were immensely amused at the sight of their chargers. These animals had been collected from all parts of Egypt, from Aden and Arabia. As soon as the proper number had been received and told off to the men, the work of fitting on the saddles commenced. This was by no means easy, as the camel humps differed greatly from each other, and a good deal of padding and altering was necessary before the saddles were comfortably fitted. When the men mounted, they formed in line, and found that the animals were docile and obedient to the rein, and maneuvered together without difficulty. Several days were spent in learning to sit the animals, and there were many spills, but as the sand was deep, no harm came of them, and they caused great amusement to all except the victims themselves. The greatest difficulty was the mounting and dismounting, both of which performances had to be done when the camel was kneeling. In order to make him kneel, it was necessary to tug at the head rope, at the same time making a sound like clearing the throat. Then the rope was pulled at until his head was brought round to his shoulder. This prevented him from getting up again. The rifle, which was slung in a bucket on one side behind the rider, was found to render it impossible to get the leg over, and it consequently became necessary for the man to mount with his rifle in his hand and to drop it into the bucket afterwards. As the camel always rose and lay down with great suddenness, men were, until accustomed to it, constantly pitched over his head. "I never want to see a camel again," Edgar grumbled, after 1 or 2 days' exercise, diversified by numerous falls. "They are the most discontented beasts I ever saw." "I don't mind their growling," a trooper said. "It is the twistiness of the brutes I hate. When you are looking after a horse, you know what he can do and where he can reach you. Of course, if you get behind him, he can kick. But when you are standing beside him, all that you have got to look after is his head, and he cannot bring that round to bite very far. These brutes can reach all over the place. They can kick at you any way. They can scratch their ears with their hind legs, and even rub the top of their humps with it if they are disposed, or scratch themselves under the chin. Their necks are the same. They can twist them anywhere. They can bite the root of their tails, and lay their heads back and give them a rub on the top of their humps. There is no safety with them at all, and when they come at you growling and roaring, with their mouths open and showing their teeth, it is enough to scare you. It is fortunate that their hoofs are soft and spongy, so that they cannot hurt like the kick of a horse," Edgar said. "Spongy be blowed," the trooper replied. "Mine kicked me in the chest yesterday, and I went flying about 10 yards, and the breath was knocked out of my body for a quarter of an hour." "That was bad, no doubt," Edgar laughed. "But if it had been a horse, you would be in the hospital tent now with some of your ribs broken, if you hadn't been smashed up altogether." "They are up to all sorts of tricks," the trooper went on, looking savagely at his growling camel. "There was Rogers this morning. He was just passing a camel who was kneeling down. Well, who would think that a kneeling camel could do anything except with his head? Rogers swore that he did not go within 4 yards of him, and the brute suddenly shot out his hind leg and caught him on the knee and cut him clean over, and he thought for some time that his leg was broken. Blow all camels, I say." As the camels were not to be used for fighting from, in the presence of an enemy the troopers were to dismount and fight on foot. When down, the camels were to be knee-haltered, one of the forelegs being doubled up and strapped, which prevented the animal from rising. Each camel received about 5 pounds of grain night and morning, and the whole were taken down to the river every other day to drink. The conduct of many of them was exasperating in the extreme to their riders. When taken down into the stream, they would stand and look about in an aimless way, as if wondering what on earth they had been brought there for, and would be sometimes 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour before the idea seemed to occur to them that they might as well have a drink. Once on the march, they went steadily and well, obeying the slightest motion of the halter, and keeping up their regular pace without intermission from the time they started until they were ordered to halt. After a week's drill and practice, the men became accustomed to the ways of their animals, and were glad when the order came for them to start. By this time, the leading regiments of the infantry had begun to go up in their boats. These were broad, flat crafts, which had been specially built in England for the purpose. Each carried 12 men, and 3 months' supply of provisions and stores for them. They were provided with sails and oars, and as the direction of the wind was up the river, the sails were of great assistance. As the cavalry passed the great cataract, they had an opportunity of seeing the process of getting the boats up. The rush of waters was tremendous, and it seemed well nigh impossible to force the boats against them. It would indeed have been impossible to row them, and they were dragged up by tow ropes by the united strength of the troops and a large number of natives. At times, in spite of all the efforts of the men at the ropes, the boats made no progress whatever, while if the steersman allowed the stream for a moment to take the boat's head, it would be whirled round and carried down to the foot of the rapid, when the work had to be recommenced. The troopers thought, as they watched the exertions of the infantry, that, rough as was the action of the camels, they had decidedly the best of it. But such was not their opinion on the following day when, as they were jogging wearily along, several of the boats passed them, running before a strong wind, with the soldiers on board reclining in comfortable positions in the bottom or on the thwarts. Again their opinions changed when, the winds having dropped, they saw the men laboring at the oars in the blazing sun. "There are pulls both ways," one of the troopers said philosophically, "and take it all round, I don't know which has got the best of it. If there are many of these cataracts, I should say we are best off, and they say there are lots of them between this and Khartoum." "I think we have got the best of it, certainly," Edgar said, "for if it comes to leaving the river and pushing on, we are sure to be in it." The journey from Wadi Halfa to Dongada was 235 miles. The day's march was generally about 20 miles, the halting places being made at spots previously settled upon, where there were depots of provisions formed for them. The start was made about 5 o'clock in the morning. For the first 2 hours the men walked, leading their camels. Then, when the sun became hot, they mounted and rode the rest of the distance. At first they found the monotonous motion very trying, but became accustomed to it in time, and would even go off to sleep in the saddles, with the result, however, that they were probably shot off if the camel came upon a sudden irregularity of the ground. In the cool of the evening the men bathed in the river, and the officers often went out in search of game, which was found, however, to be very scarce. There were many regrets among the men that they had brought no fish-hooks or lines with them, for these would have furnished not only amusement during their halts, but might have afforded a welcome change to the monotony of their diet. The country bordering the Nile was composed of low rocky hills and hard gravel, with occasional tufts of dry grass and scrub. Sometimes the troops marched 4 abreast. At other times they had to go in single file across the rocky ground. The fun of the camel riding very soon passed off, and the men found the marches extremely dull and monotonous, and were heartily glad when they got to Dongola. Here the rest of the regiment joined them. Marching 20 miles up the river, they crossed the Nile in boats, and another day's march took them to Shabadud, and after a stay there of some days, drilling with other corps, they moved on to Korti, 4 days' march. The The site chosen for the camp delighted the men. Groves of palms grew along the steep banks of the river. Beyond were fields of grass and broad patches of cultivated land. Here they were to wait until the rest of the mounted troops came up, and a portion, at any rate, of the infantry arrived in the boats. End of chapter 9.